Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
Finally come to the personal memoirs of Ezra. The book of Ezra is somewhat difficult because in chapters 1 through 6 it hasn't dealt with Ezra at all, but with first Shashbazzar and then Zerubbabel and Joshua, which I think are two subsequent returns. And now we're coming, I think it's the third return under Ezra that begins, it's almost all in the first person, except for a few little places here and there, in chapters 7 through 10. Now we're going to do chapters 7 and 8 today. We get into some of the personal history of Ezra. It's such an unusual account because there's such neat little personal notes thrown in here and there that just show us the life situation. It's really a neat time. Let's look at chapter 7. Now, after these things, now there is a gap of about 57 or 58 years between chapter 6 and chapter 7. All right, look at your outline that we've provided. Now, what this is primarily is another king's reign. We don't know anything of what happened to the exiles under Zerubbabel and Joshua. We don't know if they were prospered or if they were defeated or how they were doing. From the mixed marriages, it shows they had kind of compromised with the culture in which they found themselves. So the date here is about 457 BC. We learned from verse 7, it's the 7th year of King Artaxerxes I, and he reigned from 464 to 423 BC. Okay? Chapter 6 dealt with the reign of Darius I, Hastrapes, and he reigned from 519 to 486, and you see the gap that's there. Okay? In the reign of Artaxerxes I, king of Persia, there went up Ezra, son of Seraiah. Now, apparently Joshua, who was the high priest under Zerubbabel, is related to Ezra because they have the same ancestor. Now, this man, Seraiah, was high priest when the exile occurred. And you can see him in, 2 Kings 23, verse 18, so 586, when he was taken captive. Notice it mentions that he's the son of several men. Now, Hilkiah was high priest under Josiah, the godly king, 2 Kings 22, 4 through 14. So Ezra has some tremendous ancestors. Now, if you might want to think through this, if you could picture in your mind, on one side of the page, the kings, and the other side's the high priest that returned. Now, under Darius I, it was Joshua. Under Xerxes, it was Joachim, Joiakim. And under Artaxerxes, it's Eliashib. And so here we have the high priest during this period. Now, Ezra is not only a scribe, but he is of the priestly line. And that's what all this next few verses is all about. It's trying to show the lineage of Ezra. Remember back in the earlier chapters, they were so picky about the priests being able to document their lineage. The lineage was very important to the Jews to show they were the returning people of God and to somehow deal with the inheritance problem from the Old Testament. Now, there are 6 people missing here in verse 3. 6 names. Some say 7, but I think only 6. And you might well see 1 Chronicles 6, 3 through 15, with a full list of ancestors given. In all the genealogical lists in the Old Testament, sometimes son means grandson, great-grandson, great-great-great-grandson, and on and on. When it calls him son of Sarai, it means great-grandson, up in verse 1. So here's an example of Hebrew genealogy. Now, those in verse 5, we're going back to Phinehas and Eleazar and Aaron. Now, this is one of the major lines of the priest. The Levites, the tribe of Levi, were designated the servants, and they took the place of the firstborn as far as those dedicated to God to serve Him. Later on, the family of Aaron was marked out to be the priest inside the tribe of Levi. And so now Aaron's sons is what we're going to find through here, and the ones returning under Ezra are both Ezra's sons, while the ones returning under chapter 2, Zerubbabel, were only of one line, the Zadok line. But here we have both of them, and they're both restored to priestly service. Notice in verse 6, this Ezra went up from Babylon. Now, this went up is not topological, it's theological. To the Jews, going to Jerusalem meant always going up, even though sometimes it was physically down. from Babylon. Now remember, Nehemiah is going to come from Susa, but Ezra comes from the capital city of Babylon. And he was a scribe. Now the word scribe, Ezra is such a big figure in rabbinical Judaism. Matter of fact, from the apocryphal book, 2nd Ezra, chapter 14, they say he edited all of the Old Testament and wrote 70 mystery books. Well, Ezra may have been an editor, but or a compiler. But he is primarily, he started the great synagogue, they think. And so it's a very, very important figure in rabbinical literature. Notice it calls him skilled in the law of Moses. Now the word skilled means rapid. You might well see Psalms 45:1. The law of Moses, and by the way, I do not hold to the JEDP theory of source criticism. I believe that Moses was involved in the compilation of oral and written sources that we know as Genesis through Deuteronomy, called the Pentateuch, which the Lord God of Israel had given. Notice it's not the law of Moses, it's not the law of man, it's not simply a variation of Hammurabi's code. It's a particular code given by God for theological as well as social reasons. You remember that. And the king granted him all that he requested. Now notice the human instrumentality, because the hand of the Lord was with him. Notice the theological impetus. This is very important to realize, that God uses men, but history is in the hands of God. You will see again Philippians 2:12 and 13. And some of the sons of Israel, and some of the priests and Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants went up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. Now this list here of these different kind of temple services is also found back in chapter 2. And we're going to talk about particular ones of them over in verse 24, the Nethinim particularly. This is different categories of those people who serve the temple. Let's see if we can look at it real quick. There are the priests who offered sacrifice and offered sacrifice. Then there was the Levites who helped the priests and also taught the people. Then under those Levites, there were gatekeepers, there were Levitical singers, there were these special slaves and servants, both attributed to David and to Solomon, and all of this large entourage made up the personnel of the temple. Now, notice what it mentions here in verse 8. And he came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. This is July of August of about 457. Now notice where it mentions the 1st month in verse 9. Well, they left in the 1st month. It's going to take them somewhere around 4 months to make the trip. Now notice it's only 500 miles from Babylon to Jerusalem if you go straight across the Arabian desert. But you can't do that. So they had to go up the Tigris-Euphrates River valleys, known as the Fertile Crescent, up and then down, which is about a 900-mile trip, and about 4 months is normal with all the women and children they had to go with them. Okay? Now notice what mentions the 1st month. This would be March, April. And he began to go up from Babylon on the 1st of the 5th month. He came to Jerusalem, because the good hand of the Lord was with him. Now this good hand of the Lord is repeated over and over throughout this as God's presence. We see it in chapter 7, verse 6, verse 9, verse 28. Chapter 8, verse 18, 22, 31. Nehemiah 2, 8, and 18. It's a theological phrase, like we would say, God be with you, or God provided. That's what they're saying here. Verse 10. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, to practice it, and to teach his statutes and ordinances in Israel. What a great order that is. He studied it, and we know he studied 58 years already of this. He took personal interest and time to know the Word of God. And then, before he told anybody else what to do, he internalized it and practiced it himself. His life and his teachings coincided. And boy, that's a way to know who speaks for God. Now, then in verse 11. Now this is a copy of the decree that King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra. Now from chapter 7, verse 12 through 26 is the last Aramaic section of the book of Ezra. It seems that Ezra is made up of a lot of official documents from the Persian period. Now the Persians spoke Persian, but because their realm was so wide, they used Imperial Aramaic as the lingua franca of the political arena, and that's what these documents were in. Okay? Now, notice where it mentions here, Artaxerxes, king of kings, and then a little bit later it says, the God of heaven. Now here are two Persian phrases. King of kings was used by the Assyrians, but not very much. It became the common phrase for Persian rulers to use of themselves. The God of heaven, that was their common designation for Ahura Mazda, the good God of Zoroastrian dualism. There is Ahura Mazda, light, and there is Angra Mayenta, evil or darkness, in the Zoroastrian system, which was the Persian religion. Now, one more while I'm on this subject is down in verse 14 where it says, the king and his 7 counselors. We learn from Ezra chapter 1 verse 14 that the 7 counselors were still in place in Ahasuerus or Xerxes' day. We also learn from Exophon, his Antibasis, and I can't pronounce that real well, 1, 6, 4, and 5, that Cyrus had 7 counselors. We also learn from Herodotus, chapter 3, section 84, that these 7 families were characteristics of the Persian rulers and probably were the noble families that helped them. And they had unrestricted access to the king. So here we have Persian phrases. The reason I bring that up, there's been much debate over that these aren't true historical documents because there's so much Jewish phraseology in them. Well, it's true there's Jewish phraseology because I believe the Persian people used Jews to help write them. But there's also tremendous Persian phraseology that shows the historicity of these Aramaic accounts. Now, notice it says in verse 14, the law of God which is in your hand. Ezra apparently was known for his ability to know, discern, and interpret the law of Moses. Also, notice he had the law of Moses. It wasn't something that was later developed. Now, notice we have to bring silver and gold, which the king and his counselors have freely offered to the God of Israel, whose dwellings in Jerusalem. Now, verses 15 through 20, we see 4 sources of revenue for not only the returning trip, but the sacrifices to be instituted in Jerusalem. Okay? Now, first is silver and gold, and apparently it's a free will gift from anybody they can find, including the king's going to help and his counselors. Number 2, it's a free will offering from the Jewish people. Number 3, then in verse 19, the utensils. Now, this does not seem to be the utensils from the temple, which were given to Zerubbabel many years earlier. But this seems to be gold and silver vessels that Jewish people or the Persian nobility or whoever gave to Ezra to sell to use the money for the temple. And finally, in verse 20, we say the rest of the needs are to be met from the temple treasury. Now, not the temple treasury in Persia, but the temple treasury from the region or the area called beyond the river, which would be Syria and Palestine and going down as far in Egypt as we could. So that's the 4 sources of revenue here. Notice in verse, 22, it mentions 100 talents, 100 cores, 100 baths. Now I want to take just a moment with you, and I've showed you this book before, Ancient Israel by Roland DeVoe. There are 2 volumes. Volume 1 is the social institutions, and Volume 2 is the religious institutions. I want to take a moment in this Volume 1, and I'm going to start on page 201, to show you the different measurements and what they mean. Now, a homer equals a core, and that's the largest one. Then an ephah equals a bath, and there are 10 of those to 1 homer. And then we have a selah, and there are 30 of those to 1 homer. And then we have a hen, there are 60 of those to 1 homer. And then we have another spelling of a homer, also called a seron. There's 100 of them to a homer. And then we have a gab, there's 180 of them. And then we have a log, there's 720. Now, before I leave this measurement table, I want to show you the weight measurements as far as money, and that's found on page 205 of Volume 1. A talent is the highest. A mina, there's 60 mina in a talent. There's 3,600 shekels in a talent, and there's 72,000 gura in a talent, and there we see that monetary equivalent. Now, listen to me. It is very difficult to go back and put a modern gallon or quart or dollar equivalent to this. These were large measurements, but you really can't say how much it would be equivalent to in our day. First of all, we're not sure about the measurements precisely. The measurements I gave you are from the book of Ezekiel, from Rabbinical Judaism, and from Jerome. And that's, late. So we're not certain about what they are, and so we can't be dogmatic. Now, notice if you would in verse 23 where it says, whatever is commanded by the God of heaven, let it be done with a zeal for the house of God of heaven, lest there be wrath against the kingdom of the king and his sons. Now, it's interesting to note that in this year, 457 BC, there was a revolt in Egypt under Artaxerxes I, and maybe this is an allusion to that. Now, this idea about setting up the local deity's temple and reinstituting their sacrifice in very precise ways was part of the Persian Empire. We saw it under Cyrus, we saw it under Darius, and here it is again under Artaxerxes. And it's a very common aspect of the Persian period. And we'll see chapter 6, verse 10. Now notice in verse 24 we have these no tax to the Levites or priest. And then we mentioned the priests, the Levites, the singers, the doorkeepers, and the Nethinim are the servants of the house of God. Now we'll see the list of chapter 2. I believe it begins in about verse 43 through 54. This name Nephilim does not appear anywhere else except in Ezra and Nehemiah, and they were assistants to the assistants. There's many foreign names included, which means they were probably somewhat like people who were captured and became temple servants. And so it was originally a slavery deal, but became to be a voluntary thing. A very, though it was hard work, it was a tag of respect in its day. Okay. Now verse 25. And you, Ezra, according to the wisdom of your God, which is in your hand, appoint magistrates, judges, they may judge all the people who are in the province beyond the river. Now we learn from Persian documents that there are two types of administration under the Persian system. There was the political satraps who really controlled the provinces, but as the Persians allowed local worship, they also allowed local law and order according to the custom of the people of that land. So Ezra was dictated by the king to set up this local, provincial law and order based on the law of Moses, and that's, of course, what he did. Now, verse 26. Moreover, however, whoever will not observe the law of your God, the law of the king, let judgment be executed upon him strictly, whether for death or for banishment or for confiscation of his goods or for imprisonment. Now, here are the different ways under a legal system that a man could be punished. And this is, we found, quite the setting of Ezra and Nehemiah's day. Now, in verse 27, here's the prayer of Ezra. The Hebrew section begins again. Blessed be the God of our fathers. Notice verse 28. Has extended us loving kindness to me. Now, I mentioned to you in a couple lessons before, there are two special Hebrew words used to describe the covenant God and His relationship with Israel. The word is Yahweh, and you see it here in verse 27. It's when the word Lord's in all caps. It's YHWH from the Hebrew verb to be. Now, the second characteristic word or verb is in verse 28. My New American Standard makes it loving kindness. King James has it mercy. It's the Hebrew word Hesed. It speaks of God's covenant loyalty. And of course, these folks returning to rebuild the nation of Israel needed to hear about God's covenant loyalty. Notice Ezra attributes his strength to God and not to any academic acumen he may have, or physical strength, or political power. Now, in chapter 8, this is a chapter that deals much like a registration of the people that return. It deals with him preparing for his trip, finding he needed some more Levites, procuring them, and then moving on to Jerusalem. And so chapter 8 is kind of a summary of this. Now these are the heads of the fathers' households and the genealogical enrollment of those who went up with me from Babylon in the reign of King Artaxerxes. There's a little bit of difference between this and what's listed in chapter 2. Although the families are still in place for the most part. Okay? Joab of chapter 9 seems to be listed twice, or a separate Joab, we're not sure. He's mentioned quite often in Pahath Moab, but Pahath Moab is also mentioned in verse 4, so it causes some problem for us to be sure about Joab. Now, there are a few that are missing here, particularly two. But we find them in the Apocrypha book, 1 Ezra 8, 32 and 36. And that would be Zattu, verse 5, and Bani, verse... And I forgot to write the verse down. So you can find Bani in there. And wherever it is, that's where it fits. This Apocryphal book has helped us tremendously in these geographical tables, because it really is quite accurate when you compare Ezra 2 with Nehemiah 7. And that's the two other lists that we have. It's interesting to note that both groups of Aaron's children, Phinehas and also Ithmar, are included here. Now, Phinehas is recorded in Exodus 6, 23 through 25, and Ithmar in Exodus 6, 23. Now, originally, only Phinehas' line could be priests, but after the return, both of those sons' lineage could be priests again. It's also interesting to note that in verse 2, we have a descendant of King David, just like Zerubbabel, 1 Chronicles 3, 17 and following. Let me skip down a little more. Oh, and verse 13 is an interesting phrase. It says the last ones in my New American Standard. We're not sure what that means. The phrase is very difficult in Hebrew. Because of the families mentioned here, it may mean that some returned under Zerubbabel and the rest of the family returned under Ezra. And that's what most scholars believe this phrase means. In verse 15, it was found they didn't have any Levites. There are a lot of priests, but no Levites. And the priests didn't want to do all the work. The Levites did all the heavy work for the priests. And so the priests wanted some Levites to go with them. So what Ezra does is send a delegation to a particular locale mentioned in verse 17. Apparently it was a large Jewish settlement that had many Levites there that could trace their ancestry. Now this tells me, number one, that the exile was done in certain locales, that the Jewish population was not dispersed among the Babylonian population, but they were allowed to have some autonomous cities and villages. That made the exile much easier to bear, and apparently we have one of those mentioned here. Now the word teachers in the last part of verse 16 has also been a very debated term. This word means teachers in later Judaism, but not so much here. We have a similar usage in Nehemiah 8 and 9. And we've got to be very uncertain what this word teachers means. Then it mentions about Iddo, the leading man of the place of Cassapha. Now, we're not certain where that is. We're not even sure where this river we're going to mention in just a minute is. We've lost that. It seems to be a day's travel from the city of Babylon. Some have said this Cassapha, because the word is often used of a rabbinical school, may mean a famous synagogue school. Some think, because of the Elephantine papyri, that this was a sanctuary where sacrifice was offered. But if it was, I don't think Ezra would be taking the priests who were doing inappropriate sacrifice. So I think it's probably a place name of a Jewish settlement. Now, if you notice the rest of the chapter, there's going to be a brief trip of a few days. They're going to try to get their act together, find they have some more needs, and they're going to stop and try to get everything together. Let's see. Oh, look at verse 22. And this is such a personal note. This is strewn through these last few chapters. Listen to Ezra. For I was ashamed to request from the king troops and horsemen to protect us from the enemy on the way, because we had said to the king, quote, the hand of our God is favorably disposed to all who seek him, but his power and his anger are against those who forsake him. This is what Ezra said. He had all this money, a lot of money, tons of metal, silver and gold and stuff. He says, if I'd asked the king for troops, it would have been incongruent, because I told the king that the God of heaven would protect us. And here I'm asking for troops, so I was afraid to ask. So I'm going to set a special fast day to pray and ask God to protect us on the way home, because there are many robbers and bandits. Do you catch the note of a man thinking in his heart, I can't do that. I've said this. I've got to be faithful to what I've said. I've got to be a man who acts on faith. Isn't that a very personal note? Now, just for a little sideline, Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 7 through 9, Nehemiah is going to ask for troops. And people have said, well, Ezra's more spiritual. No, my friends. Ezra acted out of the faith that he had as a religious leader, and Nehemiah acted out of the faith he had as a political leader. There is no contradiction here. One's not more faithful than the other. It's just two different ways of doing something. It's much like Romans 14 in the New Testament. But isn't that an unusual little sideline as he rationalizes in his heart? He'd like to have troops because he's kind of afraid, but he says, no, I'm going to trust God, and if I don't, the king's going to think that that God's not a faithful God. And so Ezra leaves without troops on this very dangerous time. For we learn from history, there were many revolts the first years of Artaxerxes I, and Egypt was possibly in full-blown revolt at this time. It's an interesting sideline that later on we learned that some of the revenue that was taken from these provinces and moved around, they had 20,000 troops to protect them. So you kind of see Ezra's need for a fast here. And he trusts God, but he's going to have a fast day anyway. Now, notice he set apart the 12 leading priests. Now, as you know, there were only 4 families that returned under Zerubbabel. David divided the priests into 24 divisions that they could have separate times the temple. We see here that the word 12 is used throughout this chapter. Now, whether there were examples of 12 different tribes, we're not sure, but he divided the priests into 12. Notice down in verse 35 that everything is divisible by 12 except the lambs, which is 77. Now, some have said because of the apocryphal book of 1 Ezra, chapter 8, verse 66, which has 72 lambs, which is a multiple of 12. There's a misprint here. I'm not certain. I don't think that Ezra thought that he was bringing all the tribes back, but the word 12 was a very important number. 7, 12, 40, 70. These are important numbers for the Jews, and even sometimes, I think without thinking, they divide their people in numbers up into these multiples, okay? Well, you can read this. It's very easy. There at the river Hava, there's been much discussion about this. It seems to be one of the tributaries of the Euphrates, apparently a day's journey from Babylon. We see some of Cyrus' troops stopping here and some of the archaeological finds that we have, but we're not exactly certain where it is. Now in verse 36, and they delivered the king's edict to the king's satraps. Now, the word satraps is plural, and that's highly unusual because there was only one satrap for the political region known as beyond the river. Now, we've also found that the word satrap can mean lesser officials, and that seems to be the usage here because it should be singular and not plural. What they gave to was his documentation. He said, this is from the king. I can set up a provincial religious system here. I can have punishment for crimes under my system. You're to help me from the temple treasury if I need it. And so it was a way of just saying, fellas, here, I'm a new man on the block, and here are my credentials. And that's what Ezra does. They supported the people and the house of God. And here we have Ezra the scribe beginning his ministry. And next week we'll finish the book of Ezra, chapter 9 and 10. Well, I hope it's been somewhat interesting to you. These little personal notes are so wonderful to catch this great man of faith's heart. And I think the history here is interesting. And there are many applicable things to our day. So I hope it's been an exciting study for you. And I'll see you again, same time, same place.